The morning air at the Quantico training range smelled like gun oil and old coffee. It was the kind of place where men had spent decades proving themselves, a stretch of Virginia earth where the military had carved out its toughest corners, where the grass was worn thin by boots that never stopped moving. On a Tuesday in late October, a group of roughly 30 soldiers, instructors, and senior officers had gathered near the long-range shooting bay for what was supposed to be a routine marksmanship evaluation. Nobody expected anything unusual. Nobody expected her. Chief Petty Officer Elena Vasquez walked through the gate at 0630. Her gear bag slung over one shoulder, her hair pulled back in a tight braid that disappeared beneath the collar of her jacket. She was 34 years old, 5 feet 6 inches tall, and had the kind of quiet that fills a room before anyone notices it. She did not announce herself. She checked in with the range officer, signed her name on the roster, and walked to the equipment table where the day's firearms were laid out in a neat row. The other evaluees were already there, 12 of them, mostly men in their late 20s and early 30s, pulling back bolts and running their hands along barrels with the easy confidence of people who had done this many times before. A few of them looked up when Elena arrived. One of them, a broad-shouldered staff sergeant named Connors, let out a low whistle that wasn't quite a compliment. Another, a younger man named Briggs, leaned toward his partner and said something quietly. The partner laughed. Elena did not look at them. The range master, a retired Marine named Holloway, walked down the line and stopped in front of each shooter, handing out assignments. When he reached Elena, he paused for just a half-second too long. Then he reached into the rack behind him and pulled out a rifle that did not match the others. It was an older model, a bolt-action with a weathered stock and a barrel that had seen better decades. No scope, no modern optics, just iron sights, the kind of equipment that sharpshooters had used half a century earlier, before laser rangefinders and digital ballistic calculators became standard issue. He set it on the table in front of her without making eye contact. "That's mine," Elena said. "Equipment rotation," Holloway said, already moving on. She picked it up, turned it over in her hands, checked the bore, ran a finger along the trigger group. Then she set it down, picked up her spotting equipment, and walked to the assigned position without another word. Behind her, she heard Connor say it clearly enough that it wasn't an accident, only the finest for her. Ha! There was laughter. Not just from Connors, from 3 or 4 others nearby. One of the supervising officers, a lieutenant colonel whose name Elena had seen on the attendance sheet but whose face she didn't know, was standing nearby and said nothing. He looked at his clipboard instead. Elena had been hearing things like this for 11 years. She grew up in Laredo, Texas, the middle child of a border patrol officer and a high school math teacher. Her father, Hector Vasquez, had been a man of quiet discipline, the kind of person who expressed love through correction, who taught his children that excellence was not optional, that the world would always look for reasons to say no, and that the only answer was to be so good that the no became impossible. He had taught Elena to shoot when she was 9 years old, using an old .22 rifle behind their property on Sunday mornings while her mother slept in. By the time she was 12, she could consistently hit targets at 200 yards. By 16, she was competing in state-level junior shooting competitions and winning. Not placing, winning, but winning in Texas junior competitions and winning respect in the United States Navy were two entirely different things. When Elena enlisted at 22, fresh out of a criminology degree she'd finished in 3 years, she entered a world that had only recently and reluctantly begun opening certain doors to women. She excelled in basic. She excelled in advanced training. She applied for special operations programs twice and was turned away both times without clear explanation. The third time, after a formal appeal and an intervention from a sympathetic commander named Reyes who had watched her qualify at ranges that put most of her male colleagues to shame. She was admitted into the pipeline. She was the first woman to complete that particular program in its 12-year history. The ceremony was brief. The congratulations were thin. 2 of the men who shook her hand that day told her later, separately, that they had voted against her admission. One of them became her direct superior for the next 3 years. She had learned, in those years, to treat the hostility as information. Not as injury, but as data, something to note, catalog, and file away. She had also learned something more important, that skill was its own argument. That on a range, in the field, in the moments that actually decided things, the only currency that mattered was accuracy. She had more of it than almost anyone she had ever met, and so, when she lay down behind the old bolt-action rifle with its iron sights and its worn stock on that October morning at Quantico, she did not feel what Connors and Briggs expected her to feel. She did not feel embarrassed or diminished. She felt something closer to interest. A problem to solve. A distance to close. The first target was at 500 yards. Standard silhouette. The range officer called the start. Around her, she heard the crack and pop of modern rifles, scoped and zeroed, firing in quick succession. She steadied her breathing. She calculated the wind, about 8 miles per hour from the left, gusting in short pulses that she tracked by watching the flags at 200 and 400 yards. She adjusted her hold. She squeezed the trigger. The target dropped. She cycled the bolt. The second target came up at 600 yards. She made the same calculations, adjusted for the slight shift in the crosswind, and fired again. The target dropped. She worked through the course methodically. No hurry, no theater. By the time the first stage was complete, she had hit 9 of 10 targets, the one miss coming on a wind-shifted shot at 800 yards that had been a genuinely difficult call with iron sights at that distance. Most of the scoped shooters around her had hit 7 or 8. She stood up, cleared the rifle, and turned around. Connors was staring at her. Briggs had stopped talking to his partner. The lieutenant colonel with the clipboard had put it down. Elena walked back to the equipment table, set the old rifle down with the same careful precision with which she had picked it up, and poured herself a cup of water from the jug near the entrance. She drank it standing up, looking out at the range, at the flag still moving in the autumn wind, at the targets still showing their hits. She had not yet said a word to anyone since she'd asked about the rifle. The second stage was scheduled to begin after a 30-minute break. Elena used the time to study the target placements for the afternoon, the distances, the angles, the likely wind patterns given the tree line to the northwest. She made notes in a small notebook she kept in her left breast pocket, the kind of notes that looked like shorthand, but were actually a precise system she had developed over years of competition and field work. Holdover adjustments, atmospheric estimates, contingency positions. Nobody bothered her during the break. The laughter from earlier in the morning had gone quiet. In its place was something that wasn't quite respect yet, more like the first, reluctant acknowledgement that something unexpected might be happening. She had seen that look before too. She knew what came after it. She knew what it took to turn that reluctant acknowledgement into something that couldn't be argued with, couldn't be dismissed, couldn't be explained away by luck or favorable conditions or the kind of moving goalposts logic that had followed her career like a shadow. She put the notebook back in her pocket. She finished her water. She walked back to the line. The second stage called for shooting from 3 different positions, prone, kneeling, and standing, at targets ranging from 300 to 700 yards. With the scoped rifles the other shooters were carrying, these were not easy shots, but they were manageable. With iron sights and a bolt action that had last been properly maintained, God knew when. Several of them were genuinely at the edge of what was considered achievable by standard marksmanship doctrine. Elena took her position and did not think about doctrine. She thought about the wind. She thought about the light, which had shifted as clouds moved in from the west. She thought about her breathing, her heartbeat, the precise moment between exhale and the body's natural pause that was the only time to fire if you wanted the bullet to go exactly where you intended. She thought about her father on those Sunday mornings in Laredo, his voice patient and exact behind her. The gun doesn't lie. If it misses, you missed. Own it and fix it. She owned it. And for the better part of the next hour, on a range where she had been handed the worst equipment in the rack as a message, she did not miss when the second stage ended and the scores were called. Elena Vasquez had the highest aggregate on the field. Not the highest among the women. There were no other women. The highest, period. By 4 points. With iron sights. With a rifle that had been chosen for her as a joke. Holloway read the scores without commentary. The lieutenant colonel with the clipboard wrote something down. Connors picked up his scoped rifle and walked it back to the rack without looking at anyone. Elena packed her gear. She was almost at the gate when one of the younger soldi asterisk word travels fast in the military. Not through official channels. Official channels are slow, cautious, wrapped in the bureaucratic cotton wool of process and procedure. But through the informal networks that run alongside those channels like a second river, the kind of information that matters moves at a different speed entirely. By the time Elena Vasquez drove back to Naval Station Norfolk that evening, the score sheet from Quantico had already been seen by people who had not been present at the range. And the question of how a woman with an antiquated bolt action and no optics had outshot an entire field of scoped competitors was circulating through conversations in offices and break rooms and late-night phone calls between people who had known each other for years. She did not know this yet. She was focused on something else. 3 weeks after Quantico, Elena received orders that she had been requested for a specialized assessment program run out of Dam Neck, Virginia, at the home of SEAL Team 6. The request had come through unusual channels, filtered through a senior SEAL commander named Captain Marcus Webb, a man Elena had never met but whose name she recognized from a paper he had written on long-range interdiction in asymmetric environments. The paper had been required reading during one of her advanced training phases, and she had read it 3 times. She had disagreed with 2 of his conclusions and thought his methodology in one section was flawed. She had written a detailed rebuttal in the margins of her copy. She arrived at Dam Neck on a gray Monday in November. The facility had the controlled intensity of a place where serious people did serious things and took neither lightly. The security was thorough. The personnel she passed in the corridors moved with the economy of motion that came from doing exactly what you needed to do and nothing more. She checked in with the administrative office and was taken to a briefing room where 3 men were waiting. Captain Webb was older than she had expected, mid-50s, with the kind of lean build that suggested he still ran every morning. To his left was a Master Chief Petty Officer named Darnell Okafor, who had the watchful stillness of a man who had spent a lot of time in places where being still was the difference between being seen and not. To Webb's right was a civilian she didn't recognize, a woman in her late 40s with short gray hair and a government ID badge that faced the wrong way, which Elena had noticed was sometimes deliberate. "Chief Petty Officer Vasquez," Webb said. "Sit down." She sat. "You've been nominated for an advanced precision shooting assessment," he said. "The selection process involves 3 days of evaluation across multiple disciplines. Completion doesn't guarantee placement. Withdrawal is allowed at any point. Do you have questions before we begin the briefing?" "1," she said. "Why was I nominated?" Webb looked at her steadily. "Because of Quantico. I scored highest with compromised equipment," she said. "That tells you something, but it doesn't tell you everything." "No," he agreed. "That's what the next 3 days are for." The first day of the assessment was not about shooting. That surprised her. It was about problem-solving under fatigue, a series of navigational and planning exercises conducted after a 4-hour sleep deprivation period, during which evaluees were required to build tactical response plans for scenarios that changed without warning. Elena had experience with sleep-deprived problem-solving. She had also spent years learning how her brain specifically degraded under fatigue, which functions went first, which held longer, and how to compensate for the degradation by slowing down rather than pushing through. She moved through the exercises with careful deliberation, making fewer errors than the other candidates, all of them male, all of them significantly larger than her. She did not finish fastest. She finished most accurately. That evening, after the day's assessment, she sat in the small room she had been assigned and ate a meal from the mess hall and reviewed her notes from the day's exercises. There was a window that looked out over a stretch of grass toward the water, and she watched the light go out of the sky and thought about her father and about the conversation she'd had with him last Sunday. He was 71 now, and his hands shook slightly when he poured his coffee, though he would never acknowledge it. He had asked her how things were going in the measured way that meant he was asking the real question, the one he'd been asking her entire career without ever quite saying it out loud. "Are they treating you right?" She had said yes, because that was the answer he needed, and because the full truth was more complicated than a phone call could hold. The full truth was that sometimes they treated her right, and sometimes they gave her a broken rifle and laughed. And that both of those things were true simultaneously. And that she had learned to use both of them, the support and the insult alike, as fuel. Day 2 was shooting. Multiple platforms, multiple ranges, multiple conditions. She worked through them as she always did, methodically, without performance, making her calculations and taking her shots and accepting the results. Master Chief Okafor walked the range behind the candidates, making notes on a tablet, saying almost nothing. Once, after she made a particularly difficult shot at a target that had been partly obscured by a simulated obstacle, he stopped behind her for an extra moment before moving on. She felt it more than sight. The third day was the one she had been thinking about since the briefing. It was called the integrated assessment. She didn't know the details in advance. That was deliberate, part of what they were measuring. She was given a mission package at 0500 and 45 minutes to plan. The scenario involved a simulated high-value target in a mock urban environment on the facility's training ground, a collection of buildings and alleys and elevated positions that had been designed to replicate the kind of terrain where precision shooting meant the difference between a clean outcome and a catastrophic one. The rules were explicit: no scope, no laser rangefinder, no ballistic calculator, iron sights only. Whatever she could hold in her head, she spent 30 of her 45 minutes on the map. She marked positions, calculated sight lines, estimated distances using the method her father had shown her, not with instruments, but with the geometry of the environment itself. The known dimensions of doors and windows and standard building heights used as measuring sticks. She built a mental model that was not perfect but was close. Close enough. At 05:05 she moved to the range. The scenario unfolded over 90 minutes. There were decoys. There were moving targets. There were environmental changes, a wind that shifted twice, a simulated change in ambient light when a bank of clouds crossed the training ground. There was a moment, around the 50-minute mark, when she took a shot that she knew as she fired was going to miss, not by much, but enough. Because the wind had gusted at the exact wrong instant, and she had not waited for it to settle. She accepted the miss, recalibrated, and continued. When it was over, she set down the rifle and stood up and looked out at the range. She had hit 11 of 13 targets. The 2 misses were both the result of the wind event at 50 minutes, both shots she would make differently next time. She catalogued this without judgment. Okafor was standing behind her. She hadn't heard him approach. 11 out of 13, he said. No scope. 300 to 750 yards. Moving targets on 5 of those. He paused. The previous record for this assessment, with full modern optics, was 10 out of 13. She turned and looked at him. He had the same watchful stillness from the briefing room. But there was something different in it now, a quality she had seen in the faces of a handful of people over the years. The people whose respect was not given easily and who gave it in this particular way, without ceremony. Just by stating a fact and letting the fact do all the work. The wind at 50 minutes, she said. I should have waited. Yes, he said simply. You should have. 2 misses because of it. What does the assessment record show for misses? Previous best was 3. She nodded. She picked up her gear. Chief Petty Officer Vasquez, he said behind her. She stopped. I've been running assessments here for 9 years, he said. I've seen shooters with talent, shooters with training, and very occasionally shooters who have something I don't entirely know how to describe. The ones who have it, they're not always the fastest or the strongest. They're the ones who seem to understand what the shot actually is, not just the mechanics, the meaning of it. He paused again. You understand what the shot is? She held that for a moment. My father taught me, she said. He said the bullet goes exactly where you tell it to go. So before you fire, you have to be sure you know what you're saying. Okafor looked at her for a long moment. Then he turned and walked back toward the training building without another word, and Elena Vasquez walked the other way, toward the water, where the November wind was cold off the bay, and the last of the day's light was sitting flat and silver on the surface, and she could think clearly about what had just happened and what it might mean and what she would do with it. She did not celebrate.